Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this week's episode, the first in a multi-part set, we'll explore the fascinating story of life on Britain's home front in the Great War, with a focus on the enormous impact of the Defence of the Realm Act. Well, hello, Dan. Always a pleasure to join you on the podcast. And today we're going to be starting a multi-part set where we're looking away actually from the fighting fronts in France and Belgium. And instead we're looking back to what becomes known in 1915, in fact, as the home front. And this is just such a huge and fascinating subject that we just thought it was essential to actually make multiple episodes about it.
Yeah, hi, Spence. Yeah, it was always going to be one of those things, wasn't it? I was thinking about this before we started recording. It's either going to be one of those episodes where we repeatedly say, oh, we'll come back to that. Or in fact, we just try and break it down into a few manageable chunks. So where better to start than, of course, Defence of the Realm Act, really the story, if you like, of the Great War, on the home front, at least in the early part of from 1914 onwards. And it is a remarkable period, actually, because we're going from really a pretty unprecedented period in European history into, of course, this shocking, incredible period of the Great War. But the transition is really abrupt and brutal, and we see some enormous changes going on. But it's worth, before getting there, I think, Spence, just talking briefly about what life looks like on the eve of war, because amazingly for Europe in the 19th century, it's pretty peaceful.
This is actually true. And after the inferno of the Napoleonic Wars, although, of course, there have been significant wars in Europe, not least the wars of German unification, culminating with the conquest of Alsace-Lorraine in France in 1871. The 19th century has, in comparison to the 1700s, looked relatively peaceful. And the growing spread of industrialization across Europe has led to all kinds of improvements in civilian life, civilian diet, civilian health. Now, when we look at that through the eyes of the 21st century, it often doesn't look terribly good. Infant mortality is still very high. Much of Europe's population is very poor. Parts of Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe, are still essentially living in peasant communities. So wealth is by no means evenly spread. But what's really interesting to remember is that certainly in Britain, France, and Germany in the early 1900s, if you were alive in that period and you looked back to how life was 100 years earlier or even 50 years earlier, you would reckon that life had improved. And by our standards, it still looks awfully poor. But remember, we can't judge it by our standards. You must judge it by the era in which these individuals were living in. And what's particularly interesting is that the voice of the working class, if you will, the regular person in the street, the regular factory worker, the regular farm laborer, was becoming increasingly heard in Europe in the early 1900s. If we remember that in 1848, Europe had been racked with revolutions, pretty much all of which had failed, the old order had been re-established. What we see in the late 1800s into the early 1900s is growing social tensions within European nations, and Britain no exception, where the working people, unionized in many cases, getting a stronger sense of their political purpose, their political value, are campaigning for political change and social change that will hopefully make their lives better, or at least a little bit more bearable and a little safer. And we see this played out across Germany, France, and Britain in the form of industrial strikes and protest. And it's actually given rise to some historical speculation that in the years prior to the First World War, there's actually a chance, particularly in Britain, there's actually a chance there's going to be a revolution, that the working class will rise up and will overthrow the established order. And this is actually a common motif that recurs a lot in the right-wing press in Britain prior to the First World War. There's a real sense that there's social changes in the air, whether it's industrial strikers, whether it's suffragettes protesting in favor of allowing women to have the vote, whether it's disorder on the streets, street fighting and so forth, heavy drinking. There's a sense that the social fabric of Britain not necessarily decaying, but is under pressure. And there's a certain element of that also in Germany and France, although not quite to the same extent. And so it's a very sort of tense, in some ways, period prior to the First World War. And certainly for the British establishment, there's a fear that the British working class are on the cusp of becoming really mutinous. And I think it's that fear about what the working class might do, what they want, the lengths to which they're willing to go to, actually feeds into the issue we're about to discuss today, which is, of course, the Defence of the Realm Act. But I don't know, Dan, what do you think about the state of Britain prior to the First World War? Do you buy into this idea that the country is on the brink of a revolution, or do you think that's overplayed?
It's a really good question. And truthfully, I don't think I know the subject well enough to go really in depth into it. But I do, I think, know at least a little bit about the kind of way that the story of the Great War coming about, the declaration of war, is received in Britain. I think gives us a little clue into this, actually, because as you said, the voice of the working class is really one that's heard. And I think a big part of that is the working class feel that they can actually project that at this point. The idea that, you're working class, you don't really have any say in this, you just go along with the crowd. It really, it's really challenged right at the opening shots of the Great War. And a good example of that is actually local to where I grew up, a town called Hitchin. And there's a fascinating incident that takes place just the day that war is declared, in fact. And it tells you, I think, a little more about the working, perhaps a little more about the people from Hitchin, but also a little more about the mentality of the working class, how they've got a real sense of fairness and they feel that what's right should be done correctly. And this happens in Hitchin when a gentleman by the name of Mr. Moss, who is a local wealthy landowner, he also owns a big chain of grocery stores. And as soon as war is declared, the story goes that he sees a bit of an opportunity. Because, of course, if you think back to the opening days of COVID, what's the first thing you do? Go out and buy 50 toilet rolls. You panic buy. And exactly the same thing happens in August 1914. People go out panic buying. Except Mr. Moss, he sees this as an opportunity and he doubles his prices. Now, the good people of Hitchin do not like this very much at all. In fact, thousands of them take to the street, smash all the shops in all the windows in his shop, nick everything out of there, and then descend on his home, this big, beautiful home. They even go into his garden. They pull all the shrubs out. He goes and hides in a cupboard in an upstairs room. The police have to go in and get him out. And there's almost a lynching-like atmosphere on behalf of the local class locally, who are absolutely outraged that someone from the kind of established order has taken this opportunity at the start of the war to try and make a little bit of money. And they are quite simply not having it. This, as far as I can tell, is something that is really quite new at this time period. In fact, the police don't know what to do. The famous phrase that we hear in the UK sometimes to literally read somebody the Riot Act, that literally occurs. You have to read a Riot Act. In fact, it's not done in this case. And therefore, the police in Hertfordshire, believe it or not, actually have to foot the bill for Mr. Moss's garden hose, which is cut into tiny pieces, and all his shrubs and trees that are ripped up. But amazingly, this does occur. In fact, he goes out and has to address the big crowd and tells them it was a mistake. He did it in error and he's going to revert his prices to the day before. Now, this isn't an isolated incident. It's rare, but it's not isolated. Actually, this kind of upheaval and this working class voice that we hear about is really of concern to the established order. And that's going to mean that there are going to need to be some really serious changes. And in fact, some laws that are brought about that are going to generally curtail the kind of opportunities for this kind of thing to occur. And we see very early, I think 8th of August 1914, the Defence of the Realm Act starts to come into place. And it's got many variations spent throughout time. But in effect, it's really, it's a huge deal. In fact, I don't even think you could even attempt to do anything like this today, could you?
It's absolutely incredible in the context of the day. And even now, it would produce a very strong reaction. And just before we get into the details of the Defence of the Realm Act, I'd like to pick up on the somewhat sad story of Mr. Moss the grocer and the destruction of his property. What that's speaking of is, and listeners, hope you bear with me as we drift a little bit into academic theory on this, it's speaking to something that's been observed about how home fronts function. And when nations go into major wars, not distant wars or short wars, major wars where national survival is at stake, there is an implicit contract between the population and other parts of society. And nobody writes this down. Nobody actually puts this in in law or that kind of thing. But there's an expectation that people are going to work together, and there's going to be, crucially, a sense of fairness. It's been expressed by some academics as saying the population willingly surrenders some of its rights that it would normally enjoy in return to be led competently and ultimately led to victory. But within that, so that's a compact between the population and the government. And when that starts to break down, when the population don't feel they're being led competently, you're going to get problems. But within that too, even within society, you see these kind of balances between various social groups. And Mr. Moss, I should say, the grocer, is a perfect example. He has, in academic terms, he's violated that implicit agreement because he's clearly trying to profiteer. And if there's one thing in Britain that is designed to become absolutely designed to get the population furious, it's the idea of profiteering. In fact, by 1916, 17, and certainly 18, to call someone a profiteer, even if they're not a profiteer, is a grave insult. It's one of the strongest insults you can level at somebody without actually swearing. And what this all speaks about is that there has to be some sort of balance. People have to pull together. People have to do their part. And I think in the 21st century, the closest we can see to this in the West, obviously, we're lucky enough not to have been involved in a major war with national survival at stake in our lifetimes. What we can see perhaps with this is, if you cast our minds back to the COVID era, the arguments and the intensity between those who are in favor of, say, wearing masks and those who were not in favor of wearing masks. And look at the insults that were thrown on either side, and the absolute diminishing of one another's positions and so forth. Well, imagine that in the context of 1914. And this is now about what sacrifices should be made for the good of the war effort. And if you're a business owner and you're seen to be profiteering, well, that is a serious crime. And we'll get into some more of this later. So keep this in the back of your mind, listeners, as we consider the Defence of the Realm Act, because the Defence of the Realm Act, as an incredible overriding piece of legislation, is really designed, although the architects probably don't fully appreciate it at the time, it's designed to stop that kind of social friction. And it's going to do it by being extremely repressive. It's going to try and remove any obstacle to the effective prosecution of the war. And what underpins the Defence of the Realm Act is a certain degree of fear, which goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that the social fabric of Britain is under pressure prior to the First World War, and that the pressures of war will amplify this tenfold, 100-fold, and that the nation might start to split apart. And so Defence of the Realm, or DORA, is designed to give the government almost unlimited powers about how it is going to manage civil society in the interests of prosecuting the war. And in the context of 1914, this is an outrageous piece of legislation. The fact that it passes so quickly is quite remarkable because in many ways it goes against every single aspect of British political tradition stretching back to the Great Reform of 1832. It is, in many ways, it's a dictator's charter that gives the government unlimited powers, including the ability to change all kinds of laws at a moment's notice, suppress the press, impose all kinds of punishments on people. And it passes with actually barely so much as a flutter of an eyelid. It's rushed through in those opening days of war, and it's going to sit with variations throughout the conflict. And one of the first things it does, Dan, is it just immediately introduces central government censorship of the national press.
It does. And, this is an enormous thing today. We, of course, pride ourselves on freedom of press, or at least most of us that agree with that pride ourselves on the freedom of press and the ability to say what you want to say. To be able to actually, if you like, to restrict that, it is an incredible thing to do. It's something that the British, particularly British press, have always been very partisan against any kind of government interference with their publications. It's a shocking thing to do. And it's going to be something that happens not only in the national press. Censorship, of course, is going to be introduced on the battlefields as well. So news coming back from the front lines, and even that gets there, is not necessarily allowed to be published. Now, we do see this change and fluctuate as the war goes on. And Spence, I'm going to come back to you in a moment on censorship, because I know it's something that you know better than I do. But it's a huge change, and just one of a raft of sweeping changes. To give you an idea as we go through here, things like strikes being banned. That's an enormous thing in this period of time. The introduction of daylight savings time, which we'll come back to. Regulations for blackouts. We're talking about internments of foreign aliens, as they're referred to. Even basically everything related to efficiency or increasing efficiency in industrial output. No doubt there's more to say about that. We'll come back to it again. I want to touch on one, though, Spence, which I've cleverly segued to, which is one of my favourite subjects to cover, and that's alcohol limitation in the Great War, because this is a fascinating subject. And I think the quote that underpins all of this is famously from David Lloyd George, who says the following: "We are fighting Germans, Austrians, and drink. And so far as I can see, the greatest of these deadly foes is drink." Now, this is I think, a great line. But secondly, actually, again, goes back to this idea of efficiency. And part of what DORA does, and this is at least my way of seeing it, part of what DORA does is to try and increase efficiency across the board. Reduce wastage at a national level, increase industrial output. It's a total war kind of measure. And one way to do that is seen as to basically make people drink less alcohol. This is an absolutely fair point. And a couple of things that come in here, which are really powerful, and they really change the fabric of British society in a sense, is pub opening and closing hours. Traditionally, pubs have always been an important and really central hub in British life, particularly for the working classes. But in the wartime, what happens is that there's a closing period introduced, in fact, much shorter serving hours. So pubs are only allowed to open from 1915 onwards between midday and 2:30 in the afternoon, and then reopen 6:30 at night until 9:30 p.m. In fact, there are other limitations for people in pubs at that time as well. So drinks, beer in particular, is going to be watered down. It's not going to be as strong. You can't get as drunk as quickly. And at the same time, you're no longer allowed to buy that famous British thing of all things in a pub, a round. You cannot buy drinks for other people. You can only buy drinks for yourself. Now, this is, I think we can perhaps take it too far. I hope I don't. But this is a really, really important thing. The history of the pub, or the public house in Britain, is absolutely immense. And it's so closely linked, particularly to the working class. If we go back 400, 500, 600 years from the First World War, and you think about the idea of a public house and literally what the word means there, a public house, it's quite simply somewhere where people go and congregate in the evenings. You know, if you're a working class guy and you're working as an agricultural labourer, chances are by the time you've finished your working day, a lot of these guys don't have enough wood to go and stick the fire on, or don't have ready meals or loads of extra food that they can cook. What a lot of people will do is they'll go to the local public house, because they've got a fire on, they've got meals that you can get, they've got drink that you can have, and it's also where you're going to share your information and your gossip and your rumours. So pub life is absolutely central to British history and has been for hundreds of years. Now, DORA comes along and basically in a day utterly explodes that. This is a really, really big deal, Spence.
This is huge. It's because it's a massive cultural change. And whereas the public might be forgiven in a way for some of the immediate restrictions of DORA, so no strikes, so we'll come on to that in a moment, not everybody's part of a union. In fact, the majority of the population probably aren't members of a union, and so it doesn't really affect them so much. Press censorship isn't necessarily something anyone would really notice, although Britain is a huge newspaper reading nation in 1914. It's often said that the British public read newspapers like no other nation in Europe, but they read from the back page onwards, i.e. they turn straight to the sports section, which is on the back page, read that, and by the time they get to the front, they've lost interest. The alcohol limitation aspect, though, is huge because, as you say, Dan, this is a linchpin of British society in a way that perhaps isn't really seen there isn't really a comparison that you can draw with France and Germany here. You made a great point that for a lot of working class people, the pub is actually a nicer place for them to go than their own house. It's going to be warm. There could be a fire there. There will be a fire there in the colder months. There'll be good company. The beer is often very cheap. Beer is cheap in Britain at this stage. You can have some company in a comfortable surrounds and some comfortable chairs or benches, drink with your friends, and then go home. And to have this restricted is really a culture shock. What's striking is that this is accepted remarkably well, and it actually unites a certain sort of cross-party alliance around it. That there is a small prohibition movement in Great Britain, the Temperance Society, who campaign to stop people drinking, because alcohol is a problem in pre-1914 Britain. There's a lot of Alcoholics, it undoubtedly contributes to early mortality, various other things, violence in the streets, domestic violence. There's reasons to try and reduce this. So the Temperance Society is in favor. Both major political parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives, are in favour because it's going to lead to a workplace efficiency. The Labour Party is in favour because, again, of this idea that it's going to lead to efficiency and also that it's going to allow workers to have more money. They're not going to spend their money on drink, which is a known problem prior to 1914. But culturally, it's difficult to get across how huge this is. This is something that is so entrenched in British society that suddenly not having that in the way that you used to have it is a culture shock. But perhaps the biggest surprise is that the public accept this, that they recognize that, well, this sacrifice has to be made. And although there's grumbling, particularly from publicans, because this is their potential future disappearing in this legislation, in general, this goes through without too much of a complaint. Although, interesting point, what it does lead to is a thriving black market for alcohol. Either people, you can go around the back of a pub and buy yourself a jar, literally a jar of beer. Britain's very much a beer drinking society, more so than a spirits drinking society. Buy yourself there's all kinds of illegal selling of beer. And it's interesting that of major figures who go even further and say, well, it's not that I'm going to go to a pub, I'm not going to drink at all. Number of significant figures swear off drink. King George V, Lord Kitchener, David Lloyd George himself swears off drink. But of those three, David Lloyd George falls off the wagon secretly very soon after he's sworn off drink. I think one of the reasons people accept it, though, and this is an important point about DORA and the fact that it's not really noticed when it's introduced, is people aren't really thinking about the long term. The nature of the crisis in 1914 brings everyone together. It unifies people in broad brushstrokes, and people are willing to make these sacrifices. If you'd gone to the British public in 1914 and said pubs are going to be closed, there's going to be heavy prices on alcohol, there's going to be all these restrictions, and you're going to endure them for 4 and a bit years, I'm not sure the public would have responded quite so enthusiastically, Dan.
No, definitely not. You know, it's one of those interesting things, actually. And we said, actually, before we started filming, these rules, these introduction of DORA and all the variations, and there are many of them that come about post-August 1914, are so striking that you can almost compare them to the emergency powers that were enacted in Germany in 1933. That sounds like a really harsh thing to say, but it's that big. You know, there are so many limitations on everyday life. And this is something that I think if you tried to introduce them, Spence, all at exactly the same time, there'd be too much uproar. But by drip feeding them, in a sense, you know, at what point are you going to get outraged? Is it by the August ones? Is it by the following March ones? Is it when you get an extra day added to your working summertime, an extra hour added to your working summertime day? You know, at what point? But the point is really that they're done in stages. And I think they're done deliberately in stages. But the major aim here is to increase efficiency. That's the big overriding principle. One of the things that's interesting as well is that these new laws that come in inevitably bring new opportunity. And as you said, whether it's selling dodgy beer around the back of the pub or whatever it might be, there's a couple of things that stick in my mind from back doing research a couple of years ago that I find particularly amusing, which relate to that. This is the idea of efficiency increase, particularly with agricultural output. We know the backstory to this, you know, having food stocks in the country plentiful enough to feed the army, plus loads of incoming soldiers, let alone the civilian population. Efficiency needs to be increased. And so there are in several places these new ideas that are put about. So schemes such as if you were to kill a dozen sparrows, which are seen as particularly harmful to certain crops, and deliver their heads to your local police station, you would be awarded with a shilling piece. And this is something that's given out to school children. So school kids, get out there, kill a load of sparrows, bring their heads in, and we will reward you for increasing the country's efficiency by killing this vermin. Same thing happens with rats' tails as well. Rats, they're a penny a tail they're delivered at. So if you can kill a rat, which is not gonna damage some crops or some kind of foodstuffs, you can get a penny if you deliver that tail to the police station. The one really great story that I remember associated to this is there's a guy in Hertfordshire who's arrested in 1917 for breeding rats. He's been breeding rats, chopping their tails off and taking them down to the police station. He's charged, imprisoned as a result of that. So there are some opportunities out there, not necessarily on the right side of the law, but the principle actually is quite clear. These things are generally put in place to try and make the country a little bit stronger, a little bit more robust, have that little bit more reserve as well, because food is a big factor actually when it comes to not only, of course, the fighting front, Spencer, but DORA as a whole, because a lot of things are related to food and the preservation or lack of consumption of food.
This is absolutely true. And we've mentioned many times now on this podcast about pressures on food supply, particularly in Germany, which, of course, becomes acute by the end of the war. But one of the things that is often forgotten about Britain in the war is prior to the First World War, what we would now call food insecurity, people who basically don't earn enough money to really guarantee them enough calories a week, is very high. Perhaps as high as 1 in 4 families live on what's called the starvation line, which means they're one missed pay packet from essentially starvation. That's how serious it can be. And one thing that the government is aware of that you're going to have a serious problem with in Britain is feeding the population in the event of war. You're going to have to feed the army. That's going to be drawing off a lot of food and supply. There's a risk that British supply lines are going to be interdicted, which of course they will be in the form of U-boats. Britain itself doesn't produce enough at home, but importing is expensive. So there's all these problems that are likely to increase the price of food. And the government is well aware of history to know that so many revolutions, riots, and general periods of instability stem from a lack of food. And so one thing that I think is actually is well done and is thought about, although it does get better, in fact, as the war goes on, is serious consideration about the efficiency should at least ensure that people have more money that they can spend on food. Now, initially, the government's pretty non-interventionist on this, but one of the reasons that the alcohol restrictions and pub restrictions are brought in is a feeling, probably not incorrect, that in some households, more money is being spent on drink than is being spent on food. If you remove the opportunity to spend money on drink, people will, it's thought, spend more on food. And that will help to absorb the inevitable inflation, because inflation is inevitable in this war, and indeed it does occur. And so that's a huge consideration in everything that DORA does. And over time, Britain, of course, doesn't introduce rationing until the second U-boat offensive in 1917. But over time, efforts to try and improve control of food and improve food efficiency in Britain grow and grow and grow. The slogan "Dig for Victory," which is popular in the Second World War, may have been coined in the First. If it's not coined in the First, then something quite similar is, because there's a real effort to try and encourage people to start their own allotment gardens, to grow some vegetables, to even keep chickens if they have the opportunity to do so and eat the eggs from the chickens. So there's definitely advantages to aspects of DORA. It's not just about restricting freedom. There is some idea behind it. This is going to lead to efficiency. It's going to help the population stay fed, which of course is a crucial consideration. But it can also lead to some strange laws and some strange approaches and some odd ideas. There's a very widespread rationing poster that's put out during the U-boat offensive of 17, which says, "Save 2 thick slices and defeat the U-boat." And what it's referring to is it's actually save 2 thick slices of bread. British working class has a very bread-based diet. Bread itself obviously requires various ingredients, takes time to make. Save your bread, save your bread, save your bread. This is not a popular slogan in Britain. In fact, it's actually mocked in many respects. The 2 thick slices comment is obviously being thick in Britain is a slang for being stupid. It gets mocked. There's various sort of defacing of these posters and this sort of thing. So these messages don't always play well with the general public. And it can lead to some really fussy regulation as well, Dan.
Yeah, it can. You mentioned that 1917, when rationing really comes in. We're talking about these important commodities now, and the things that are harder to get hold of. And of course, higher risk as well, because if you need to import stuff that can only be brought in from elsewhere, that's going to involve a ship with some crew on it running a gauntlet and maybe getting sunk. We talk quite often about ships in the First and Second World Wars getting sunk, bringing war materials or tanks or artillery pieces over. A lot of these ships that are getting sunk are bringing tea bags and fruit or whatever it might be. There's a real cost to the cup of tea that people are going to drink. Now, That being said, there's also, when there are limited things available, there are some pretty niche, and you've got to say this is a really niche act that is brought in. In 1917, it's called the Cakes and Pastries Act. I'm going to actually read out the government text to you because I find it fascinating, humorous, and slightly depressing in the same sense. So let's have a quick roll through this. The Cake and Pastry Order. No person shall, after April the 21st, make or attempt to make for sale, or after April 24th, sell or offer to sell, or have in his possession for sale, any crumpet, muffin, tea cake, or fancy bread, or any light or fancy pastry, or any other like article. Any cake, bun, scone, or biscuit which does not conform to the requirements of the two following provisions of this order. In the making of any cake, bun, scone, or biscuit, no edible substance shall be added to the exterior of the cake mixture or dough after it has been mixed, or to the article during the process or after baking. Cake. No cake shall contain more than 15% of sugar or more than 30% wheaten flour. Bun. No bun shall contain more than 10% of sugar or more than 50% wheaten flour. Scone, no scone shall contain any sugar or more than 50% wheaten flour. And biscuit, no cake shall contain more than 15% sugar. That's a really prescriptive Cakes and Pastries Act there, Spencer. I don't know how I would feel about that had I been living in 1917 Britain. But this is a good example, though, of one of those acts. This is how tight some of these regulations get. And we've just picked the Cakes and Pastries Act at random here. But this could be about really any facet of social life or civilian life back home at the time.
This is very true. And it brings sort of neatly back onto something we raised earlier, which is press censorship and censorship in general. And the fact that DORA represents an enormous and really unusual in British history huge expansion of bureaucracy and administration. Britain's famous certainly, even at the time, it's famous for basically running a huge empire on what amounts to a shoestring, a relatively small civil service and relatively small government, which then basically allows the country to run itself. And then suddenly with DORA, that's all changed, because to make all these regulations work, you need an absolute army of administration, and you need vast quantities of administrators, censors, and so on and so forth. And this is where DORA starts to fray around the edges, because put simply, you cannot produce that quantity of administrators. There just aren't that many available. In the era of the day, there's definitely a preference to recruiting male administrators over female administrators, and most of the men, certainly able-bodied men, are wanted elsewhere. So the administration does expand dramatically to enforce DORA, but it has all sorts of problems enforcing it. And partially this is because of legislation like the piece you've just read out, which is essentially unenforceable. It's so fussy, it requires so much investigation, it can't be really followed through. And there's one or two others, pieces of legislation produced by DORA, which are essentially cannot be enforced. So to go back to the bread, Save Bread in 1917, it becomes illegal for you to feed bread to horses or chickens. Now, that's not very nutritious for horses and chickens, but particularly if you're a working class family and you have some chickens and rationing's in, and they perhaps you don't have a lawn, you don't have anywhere for the chickens to forage, and you give them some bread just for bulk. Is anybody going to come and fine you for this? Is anyone going to investigate this for you? A neighbor, I suppose, might grass you up or so forth. But to the best of my knowledge, there were no prosecutions for feeding a chicken bread. And that isn't necessarily an indication of the success of the legislation. It's an indication the legislation cannot be enforced. And this, though, feeding bread to horses and chickens is ultimately not going to decide the war. But what might decide the war is the press. And this goes back to a point we made right at the start, that DORA censors the press. It means that now the press are subject to the censor's office. And the censor can change documents, can even cut pieces out, can remove elements, redact elements, can ban cartoons or images and so forth. Britain's a nation of newspaper readers, and the national dailies are extremely successful with circulations of millions. And what's interesting is there's a number of scandals quite early on. We discussed one in the Mons 1914 episode where a Times journalist or a Sunday Times journalist actually interviews retreating soldiers in August 1914 and blows the lid off what's happening on the battlefront. It leads to a surge of volunteerism, but it enrages the nascent census office. But because the newspaper circulation is so big, and there are so many newspapers in Britain, not just the national dailies, but also every major town and city has its own regional newspapers. There's some countryside newspapers too. Well, the census office can't possibly monitor all of them. And what this means is that whereas the national dailies generally, in fact, overwhelmingly so, conform to the census office, they self-censor themselves effectively to avoid trouble with the census office. These smaller regional newspapers, well, nobody's reading those. The census office just cannot read these hundreds of newspapers that are published every single day. And so it actually leads to this slightly odd situation where the mainstream dailies are very carefully worded, carefully organized. But if you look at a regional newspaper, particularly the letters page, you see all kinds of opinions, including letters from the front that have snuck past the censor somehow or another, that can often be quite graphic and describe the nature of battle in really intense terms. And so DORA, although it's this overwhelming legislation and it gives the government all kinds of opportunity to prosecute and to control the population, it's one thing to have that law available. It's actually another thing to put it into practice. And this leads to a sort of argument amongst historians. Is it the case that the government just can't put DORA into full practice? Or is it a case it doesn't need to put DORA into full practice? That people generally just conform with what they're expected to do? And certainly my reading of this is that for the most part, and we have to paint with very broad brushstrokes here, the British population generally conforms to what the government wants it to do. Now, there are big exceptions to this, particularly Ireland, which deserves an episode or two completely on its own. And also, in fact, in Scotland and Wales and parts of industrial Britain. But generally, in broad brushstrokes, the population willingly goes along with these changes. That doesn't mean that they necessarily follow them to the letter. As we've always said, there's a lot of eye rolling about save two thick slices and so forth. But generally, the public is committed to the war. And if they're angry about DORA or they're frustrated about it, they grumble amongst themselves rather than protesting against the government. And I think that's quite an interesting aspect, Dan.
Yeah, it is. It's very interesting. I was just thinking as you were talking there about the idea of looking at local newspapers, and I personally find them fascinating. I think they give a really interesting look about what town or city or local life is in various parts of the country at different times. And I remember thinking back that there are, of course, regular, what they call sometimes court sessions, so reports of the various crimes that have been prosecuted over the period of time. And there are different periods where you see different types of crimes brought in. 1916, 17 particularly, you see a lot to do with conscientious objection. It really dominates the headlines. Another episode for another day. But prior to that, and particularly around 1915, 16, around the height of the Zeppelin, the real Zeppelin risk, which is a big and an important one, actually, for the general public of the UK. There's a lot of things around the idea, of course, blackouts. Now, blackout is synonymous, really, with the Blitz in 1940 and the story of the Second World War. Much less well known that there is a blackout enforced in the First World War. And, in fact, it's enforced fairly rigorously, or at least to the distant reader, it looks like it's enforced rigorously. Because going back to the point you made there, Spence, about whether people actually really everybody adheres to this to the letter or not is one question. At least if you read the local press, it looks like it is. And I wonder if there's a point to make here in that rather than prosecuting everybody who breaks any of these small laws, in fact, sometimes there are just a smaller number which make a much bigger splash. And these are people who have broken a law or repeatedly broken a law. For example, riding a bike down a country lane during a blackout without a dim red light showing, which is one of the regulations. Now, if somebody does that repeatedly, quite often what you find is that they end up in the newspaper. And I wonder if that idea of them being in the newspaper, that court session, and a particularly harsh sentence given out, whether it's a fine or even a period of imprisonment, is that not there just to keep everybody else in check?
I think that's a really good point. And it's the old adage, shoot one and frighten 1,000. And I think there's an element of that there. And I also think that then contributes as well to this social cohesion that, as we keep painting in these broad brushstrokes, the majority of the population are willing to accept these changes, are willing to accept these pressures in the cause of winning the war. and indeed enduring the war. And there's various reasons why the British population is willing to do this. And one of them is, of course, that you only need to arrest and punish a handful of people who are violating these laws to encourage everybody else to do it. There's also a positive aspect, I think, to agreeing to these changes and following them through. And that's the extent to which British society is involved in the war, because, of course, Britain produces an enormous armed forces, either volunteers or later conscripts, with millions of men involved in either the Army, Navy, Air Force, or some function in war work. Even if it's working in a factory or working in a mine, this is essential war work. And then on top of that, you have, of course, enormous numbers of women then go into war industries, agricultural industries, jobs that were previously occupied by men. And so there's a huge amount of effort going into the war. And what that means is people feel that they are contributing to the war in some way, shape, or form. And quite often there's a very, very real desire to do that, because perhaps your son is at war, your husband, your brother, your daughter might be working in a factory, or all these things that families are involved in the war. It's not a distant theoretical event for many families in Britain. And so following the rules and contributing to efficiency you're helping basically your loved ones win the war. This isn't an abstract restriction. It's actually you feel that you're contributing to this. And I think that's an underrated aspect of why the population accepts DORA, that there is a general feeling that this is contributing, it's helping. And so if you're violating DORA, if you are cycling recklessly or you are feeding bread to chickens, then you may be you're criticized by your local group, your community will dislike that. And of course, there is a legal punishment as well. So it's a carrot and a stick approach in many respects with DORA. The interesting fact, I think, is that how long it's accepted without a great deal of criticism of it. Not only really in the bleak period of 1917 into early 18, you start to get this. And one of the reasons is the British public generally put their anger somewhere other than the government. And there's a number of targets for what we might term anger within British society. There are conscientious objectors who are, of course, terribly treated. They're seen as cowardly. They're betraying the nation. And of course, let's not forget, they're often painted as, well, these men refuse to fight. They'd rather let your son, husband, or brother die than they go to war. So there's that aspect. There's a real hatred of profiteers. As I mentioned earlier, by 1917, to call someone a profiteer is one of the worst insults you can give somebody. So there's that kind of hatred. And there's also, it has to be said, that there's a lot of anger towards German nationals in Britain too, Dan.
Yeah, there is. And in fact, what we see is that, and this isn't a particularly impressive period in British history, and I don't think it's a particularly good thing to do either, but we do see German internment. And German internment is really related to fighting age troops, who, of course, we should bear in mind during a period where Germany uses a national conscription anyway, and even has, of course, a pre-war conscription in many senses, a national service, which means that any German of fighting age would have, in theory at least, already had some military training with the German army. They're going to be interned. So whether they're resident in the UK or not, they're actually going to be interned and remain interned for the duration of the war. Now, some of these places it happens are already internment camps, or something that could be a de facto internment camp. There's one in particular, a place called Little Munden that I'm thinking of, a place called Library Hall. This is to do with a wealthy German banker who actually visits the UK in the pre-war years, visits East London, where there's a very high proportion of German immigrants living at that point. He sees there's a lot of destitution prior to the war of Germans. And what he does, he creates a farm colony, believe it or not. And he will invite German nationals to go and live on this farm colony. They get their accommodation, they get a little bit of basic wage to do one of two things. One is either to get enough money to get back on their feet, or the second one is to get enough money to get a ticket home. And when war comes along in 1914, this farm colony is still operating as a German farm colony. It's full of fighting age men. And so what they do is the British government come along and they stick a fence around it. And they put a camp guard, which is an old retired Boer War captain. They even charge him rent to live in his commandant's house, it should be added. But this place becomes, rather strangely, almost overnight. Bear in mind, this has been in that local town of Little Munden for years with no problems. lots of positive interactions with the local population, this becomes really a center of hatred, and all kinds of crazy rumors start flying around that there's somebody signaling off the roof at evening with a mirror, that there's somebody's digging. This one actually comes out. This is somebody is digging a platform for an artillery piece to be placed there. Of course, these things are ridiculous when we look at them now. The famous incident that happens in 1916 is a good portion of Library Hall burns down, and a big investigation comes about, and they think something's gone on here. This is local hatred come to the fore, and this is really boiling over. In fact, as it turns out, it's a drunk German who falls asleep in a haystack whilst smoking and burns down a barn and various other bits. But the point about it is there is a real belief that there are these kind of things going on, and that Germans can be fifth columnists, and they're going to be rotting Britain from within. In some cases, it's more of a government thing. The government, for example, is going to stop any German national living within about 6 miles of the coast anywhere in the UK. German nationals, male or female, are banned from owning cameras. So there are all of these kind of restrictions that go into place. Now, this is something that really, when you look back at it now, is really pretty horrific. But the truth is, this is seen as a global war, and the British public are looking for somewhere to blame. And if you've got a colony of Germans living down the road from you, well, that's a pretty easy target.
It is, and it's an unpleasant facet of human society that in very tense, stressful situations, and of course the First World War is one, that people start looking for the outsiders within the social sphere, and they'll start targeting them. And history is absolutely replete with this. In fact, it's perhaps one of the great flaws of the human mind, that inevitably people start to turn for scapegoats. And who greater than the German population, which in parts of Britain is quite a significant number of Germans actually live in Britain, who are not treated well at all during the war. Businesses destroyed, livelihoods ruined. And in some cases, these German immigrants effectively have actually lived in Britain for a long time. And that they're well known to their communities, they're even liked by their communities. And a frightening aspect for the Germans who are interned and turned upon is that people who, before the war, they were happily serving in their shop, and now first in line with rocks to break their windows. It's that quick how the mood can change. And so it's a sort of disturbing aspect. And it comes back to the idea that the safety valve, as awful as it is, if you're on the receiving end of it in Britain, is to target those who are not part of your in-group, whether they are Germans or others. And it's a really, really serious concern that begins to concern the government, in fact, especially in 1917, when there is, of course, the Tsar abdicates, the first major European monarch to fall during the war, and in some ways the one that people expect is least likely to fall, Russia being an autocratic state. He falls. There's a real mood in Britain, and it's mirrored actually in France, of industrial militancy and frustration with how the war is going. And it leads to a major and lasting change in Britain. And that's the royal family. The bastion, in many ways, of conservative British Empire imagery has to change its name, because it's, of course, the Saxe-Coburg-Gotha family, not helped by the fact that the German bombers that are bombing London in 1917 are called Gothas as well. But it's too much. And the feeling is that having this German name for the royal family in the mood in 1917, which is felt to be negative, is felt to be starting to become tired of the war, that might have a revolutionary edge to it. The royal family makes with strong suggestion from the government, makes a pretty momentous decision and changes its name down.
It does, becomes the Windsors, of course. So it's a really big change, and this is a very open thing as well. And in fact, it's mirrored all throughout the UK. There's lots of anglicisation of German names. So people who might be 2 or 3 generations distant German descendants, they're all of a sudden, Herr Schmidt is becoming Mr. Smith, and it's becoming like that on very, very big scales. In fact, we also see this mirrored in 1917 onwards in the United States, interestingly. US has a huge German population, and whilst a number of them do stay with their Germanic names, others will anglicize them. So we do see this shift. Perhaps it happens if there are Brits living over in Germany. I don't know, people with British descendants. I think the numbers are going to be significantly smaller. But this whole kind of polarizing nationalistic look can really be borne out in the idea of people going to extreme lengths, like literally changing their names to show their allegiance. It just goes to show, how wide-reaching these kind of laws are and the impact of them. Because, of course, a lot of this is driven not necessarily by the government, but by the population. It's the population that are pulling in the same way. And Spence, what you said a minute ago, I think was really important with regards to the idea of people doing their bit. For many mothers and daughters and sisters who are literally, of course, working in the war industries, a big part of doing their bit is just putting up with the privations of something like DORA. By eating less sugar on your pastry, if it feels like your son Tommy has got a better chance of living and surviving the war, absolutely, I can imagine people would do that. It's a really powerful thing, isn't it, Spence?
It is, and this is something to really keep in mind, that these are not restrictions for the sake of restrictions. And though there is certainly some fussy regulation, as we've discussed, there's a general understanding in Britain that these regulations are designed to make the war be fought in a more efficient way, and that people are willing to sacrifice if it means that your brother, husband, father, son can come home earlier and come home safer. And when you have that, and it's mirrored incidentally in France and Germany too, that the civilian populations are willing to make sacrifices because they are intimately involved in the war. And what's interesting, and this is an idea we keep coming back to, is targeting outsiders. If the outsider is felt to be interfering with the war in some way, as conscientious objectors are, as German nationals are, as profiteers are, that's why I think there's so much vitriol and hatred towards those who are not doing their bit, because they're violating this implicit social contract that you are supposed to work together, you're supposed to make sacrifices, you're supposed to, all combine to achieve victory. And it's not although people talk about what does victory mean in the First World War, that's discussed in the war. What it means to most working class families, it means your dad can come home, your sons can come home. It's very, very tangible. It doesn't matter what state Europe is at the end. You want your loved ones home and you want them safe. And for that, you're willing to make sacrifices. And when you see people who are not making those, and especially people who are profiteering from, then you're going to become very angry. We already talked about anger towards Germans. One of the reasons there's so much anger towards German shopkeepers is a feeling that they're profiteering, that they're German, they're going to profiteer. But in some ways, the biggest protest, and it's an interesting example about how DORA can be used quite quickly to try and deal with a problem, is the Glasgow rent strikes of 1915. And the background to this is that Glasgow is a boom town. It's an industrial town, of course, in Scotland. Its population has grown massively between 1850 and 1914. It's more than doubled, in fact, a huge increase in the population of Glasgow as people are drawn there for jobs. Housing in this area, always in short supply. Nearly every worker in the city rents, rather very few people own their own property. The conditions are pretty poor. The houses, the terrace houses that you're going to rent are of poor quality. And in February 1915, so some months into the war, the Glasgow landlords, who act as a sort of cartel, they're a unified group, really, they announced there's going to be a rent hike of 25%. And one of the reasons they're actually doing this is unashamedly they're profiteering, because they know that Glasgow is turning into a munitions city. And that means there's going to be increased wages. People are going to be paid more in the munitions factories. And what they really want is they want lots of people, wealthy workers, to come in and they can pay more. And the problem with that is there are thousands of women in Glasgow whose husbands and sons have gone into the army. And they don't have that kind of money. Their loved ones' wages from the army won't pay for that kind of money. Their own jobs, most women in Glasgow work, will not pay that kind of money. And it's quite obviously naked profiteering. And it leads to the formation of the Glasgow Women's Housing Association, this militant organization that is not anti-war, it's anti-profiteering. And they protest. There's various attempts to evict women who refuse to pay. The situation gets tenser and worse and worse and worse. And in September 1915, partially as a result of the heavy Scottish losses at the Battle of Loss, which we've covered in a previous episode, there's actually a tenant rent strike where there's a refusal for the tenants to just say, we're not paying these increases. And they form a group. There's some great photographs from this period where you've got women and children protesting with signs. And one of the signs that sticks in my head, there's a photograph of a little boy. He's holding a sign that says, "My father is fighting in France. We are fighting the Huns at home." Another sign from a girl that says, "While my father is a prisoner in Germany, the landlord is attacking our home." And of course, what these signs are saying is the landlords are part of the enemy. And there's a massive rent strike. There's about 20,000 families, households participate in it, maybe more. There's the city authorities attempt to prosecute them in November for striking. And there's a huge riot outside the courthouse, a protest. They refuse to allow it to happen. They won't allow anybody into the courthouse, and the city drops all charges. What happens? Well, the government sees this and thinks this is a serious problem. If this is reflected across the nation, there's going to be all kinds of problems. And so using the umbrella of the Defence of the Realm Act, the government immediately passes the Increase of Rent and Mortgage Interest Act of 1915, which basically freezes rent increases at 1914 levels unless a landlord can prove the property has been significantly improved. And although that law gets eroded later in the war, it's an incredible piece of legislation, and it probably diffuses tension that would undoubtedly have emerged across Britain if it had not been introduced. So DORA is not always a negative, but the real lesson I think from that is there's so much anger within Britain towards those who are felt to be not participating, who are not making the sacrifices that others are making. And if you're trying to make money from the war, well, that's even worse too.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think we could spend a fair bit of time going on about criminals and crime and this kind of thing, because of course what DORA also does is provide massive opportunities for those that are willing to flaunt these new laws and work around the edges and live in a little bit of a grey area. It's fascinating. I'm sure we'll come back to that in just a moment, Spence. I was just thinking actually as we were talking now though, with regards to the idea of introducing laws. It's also, the government can be pretty sly here because there are a few opportunities, and history has kind of borne this out to a certain extent. Some of these war powers or war legislations that are enacted will continue and linger well into peacetime, despite the fact they've been created specifically in an extreme environment. Income tax being one during the Napoleonic era, that's something that's brought about. Okay, we're just going to pay for the army for this period of time. Oh, peace comes along, all of a sudden that money's quite handy, so the income tax will stay. Same thing happens in the First World War with same thing happens in the First World War, British summertime, daylight savings, which of course is first enacted in 1915 to create, if you like, more working hours and increase efficiency of particularly factory workers. That has stayed. It's been adopted by basically every country in the world. Second World War, I think we have a double summer saving time in Britain. So still with us today. These are all things of the First World War. And of course, the pub closing times and opening times never fully return to what they were pre-First World War. So there are lots of things that we can still see that reflect back even in today's society that find their roots in defense of the realm. But it's interesting, Spence. I want to go back to this idea of crime and criminality, because there are some amazing things, whether it's cutting off sparrows' heads or breeding rats or whatever it might be. But one of the real key characters, if you like, is the juvenile of the Great War. The people who all of a sudden, dad and brother and all those authority figures are away fighting the war. Well, there's opportunity there too.
There is. And this is true across the Western nations as well. What's observed is after an initial sort of patriotic surge as well from juveniles, and what we're really talking here is teenagers. Obviously, if you're a child, you're a little bit out of this, but you're juvenile. And in Western Europe in the First World War period, teenagers are classed as a little bit younger than we have in the 21st century. Really, from around about the age of 12, you're considered a full teenager. And really, by the time you're getting between 16 and 18, you're considered a man or indeed a woman. And what happens, of course, is you have a generation of children who are children or relatively, like 10 or 11 when the war begins, and they grow into their teenage years as the war goes on. And their attitude towards the war becomes quite interesting and quite different. There's advantages in some ways if you're a juvenile, particularly if you're a teenage girl, because there's such a demand for work that as a teenage girl, you could potentially get a well-paid, in relative terms, job. And that's also true of boys, where you could go to work. You're too young to actually go into the armed services unless you lie about your age, which does occur. But you can go into a job and you can actually be quite well paid. And this leads to some strain on the social fabric because you start to get teenagers, 14, 15, 16. They're too young for military service and they're not yet fully classified as adults, but they're actually earning something close to adult money. They're not earning adult money, but they're earning way more money than a teenager would expect to earn previously. And it gives them a swagger. This is especially noticeable in Germany, where there's such a demand for labor that even teenagers can command really, really high prices and change job and so on, start to wear fancy things, start to buy things. And teenagers being teenagers, and this is true in Britain too, if you're a teenager with a bit of money, a lot of those teenagers aren't going to bank it. They're not going to keep it under their bed. They're going to spend it, especially if you're a boy, you're going to flaunt it a little bit to try and impress girls. And this creates social tension because this is not what should be happening. And seeing a gaggle of teenage youths who've bought some fashionable clothes and are flaunting the fact they're able to buy luxury foods in Britain is a surefire recipe for tension. And in the absence of men, with so many men away at the front or otherwise engaged in work, there's a real fear in Britain that there's this sort of epidemic of fatherlessness, which particularly affects boys, it's felt. And it can lead to criminality as well, because in terms of black marketeering and so forth, it's a lot easier to use children and teenagers who are less likely to arouse authority suspicion to move things around or conduct sales. And if you're a ne'er-do-well, if you're a criminal, you're at the grey, working in the grey, you're going to try and recruit children and teenagers. And again, they're going to potentially earn some money. And one of the biggest scares, I suppose, in British society is in the winter of 1718, a very bleak winter in Britain, indeed in the world, there's a real fear that there's just juvenile chaos and that the youngsters are out of control, especially young boys. And there is, of course, street fighting. Street fighting is a big culture in Britain at the time, a lot of gang warfare, scuffles and so forth. And it leads to a huge clampdown, actually, again, under the auspices of Dora. In 1918, there's a noticeable rise in juvenile prosecutions in 1918, starting in 17, going into 18, in response to people saying these teenagers are out of control. And the general feeling is, well, they haven't had fathers at home to actually influence them, which in many cases is absolutely true. I'm sure there's certainly an element of that. But also there's the complexity of the war underpinning it, the fact that many teenagers are now earning more than they would have done previously, that teenagers sense that society is a little different now, that there's more opportunity to do things. And also, some teenagers are pretty shaken by what's happening in the war. They're worried about it. They feel a sense of nihilism about the war and so forth. So there's all these factors playing into it, but it contributes because in terms of juvenile delinquency and misbehavior, so much of it is tied into violating DORA regulations too. That becomes a factor because teenagers, being teenagers, will try and push and break and bend the rules. And DORA gives them plenty of opportunity to do that, as well as flaunting their wealth, as well as doing, if you're involved in criminal activity, just breaking the law. It is undoubtedly a thrill for certain teenagers. Nobody was ever prosecuted for feeding a piece of bread to a horse, but I can strongly imagine there'll be groups of teenage boys in parts of Britain who would gleefully feed bread to horses, full in the knowledge they were breaking the law. But it's a real concern for the government that the social fabric is eroding, it's breaking down. And what happens is the British public as well complains about juveniles misbehaving, complains about it. Women say, well, we can't discipline our sons. They're too big and strong and the husband's away, may even have been killed. We need more prosecutions. And so there's actually a bit of an outcry. And the government uses the DORA provisions to really clamp down on lots of small juvenile misbehaviors, leaving aside people who are carrying black market goods and so forth, which is a bit more serious. There's a real clampdown, and a number of prosecutions increased by a significant percentage in 18, largely to try and assure the British public, well, something is being done. And these are all sort of interesting aspects of how DORA, originally designed to stop British social fabric completely collapsing, can also be used actually to sort of prosecute naughty teenagers by 1918. It's such an overarching, complex piece of legislation that you can almost do anything you want with it. And what I think is fascinating, Dan, is in a way, Dora is a dictator's charter.
Wow, strong. Yeah, I think I'm going to go with you on that, though. It's a very powerful thing to think about. To go back to the idea of teenagers, their gambling is one of the things that we really see clamped down on. And I just want to make another point here, because, of course, we are talking about dad being away. But we need to bear in mind, in 1915 to 1918, quite often mum's away too. Somebody's got to earn the family wage. Mum's in the factory. She's doing the job that dad used to do. So in many cases, you've got some young lads with a bit of money in their pocket and no authority figure to look at. In fact, limited police to police them. In many cases, female police officers. This is a recipe for enormous fun in some senses for a teenager, and also disaster for a parent who gets home after a hard day in the factory and having to deal with the mess that they've left behind. Dora, of course, is here to act as, if you like, a bookend and try and keep Britain broadly on the straight and narrow as they come through, eventually emerge from the far end of the Great War. It is sweeping. It's powerful. I personally don't think it would fly today with British society the way it is, and the way that there's so much more individualism today, and not necessarily that implicit obedience to rules that are put out. It's very powerful to think about. There are many different aspects that we've not covered. And in fact, I think we will cover in future episodes, things like conscientious objection, and of course, the very vital role of women on the home front during this period of time, which I think may very well be our next episode in this sequence.
Just on sort of willingness to submit to Dora, it's a really interesting point. And even at the time, and indeed just after the war, there's writing about why does the British public do this? Why is it accept these restrictions so readily? And there's particularly what we might term very left-wing writers, left-wing politicians, intellectuals. They're a little bit dismayed, in fact, that the British public has so meekly, it seems to their eyes, gone along with these rules and regulations. And there's sort of discussion about it. But I hope in this episode we've shown that for most of the British population, in actual fact, they feel they're involved in the war. They feel they're contributing to the war, and they're willing to submit to this on the understanding that it will last for as long until victory is achieved, and that those sacrifices will be worth making. And so it's a complex issue. It's not so much about, I don't think, about the lack of consciousness in the British society, because as we've seen, things like the Glasgow rent riots go explicitly against large aspects of Dora. Strikes are illegal under Dora, and yet the women and children of Glasgow strike very effectively, and the government supports them in the end. It's all about this social cohesion. It's all about this implicit contract between the population and the government. And though Dora is potentially an extremely repressive piece of legislation, and in aspects it completely reshapes British society, the British public is willing to go along with it as long as the war continues. And interestingly, as we'll see in future episodes, one of the reasons for that is portions of the British society are going to actually benefit from the war in unexpected ways. But that's a comment for one of our future episodes in this set, Dan.
It is indeed. And on that note, we'll leave you for this week. There's plenty more to talk about the home front, some fascinating things to cover. So do please stay with us. I just want to finish actually really briefly with a huge thank you. We've had loads and loads of emails come in, particularly in the last few weeks. People just giving us suggestions, things that we should cover in future topics, just saying that you're dialing in, where you're dialing in from, and that you're enjoying it. Thank you so much. It's really incredible. It's actually so much that we've been unable to reply to everybody. I wanted to at least leave this message on here for you guys listening into the podcast to say thanks very much. We absolutely read every single one. I can promise you of that. So we will do our best to get back to you. But if not, please don't think that your valuable time in sending us emails has been wasted. It absolutely hasn't. With that in mind, Spence, we're going to round up for today. Of course, thanks for your company. One final plug, actually, if you guys are listening in on this using Apple Podcasts in particular, do please take a moment to leave a review. We're going great guns on Spotify. It's incredible to see, and we're dead proud of it. Apple, we're a little behind the curve so far. We're hoping to move up in due order as well. So if you're listening in on Apple and you do get a chance, you enjoyed today's episode, do please leave us a quick review. It is hugely appreciated. But that's all for this week. We'll see you again soon. You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon. But you're right. Look, Dora's here to try and keep the if you like, keep the stuffing in the couch. I don't know why I come up with that. That's not. Why did I suggest that? It works. It's weird, but it works.